God bless you. My name is Harris Kakalides, and you're watching here in the program, Getting to Know Jesus. And today I wish to talk about the difference between the Old Testament and New Testament in reference to the Holy Spirit. In both the Old and the New Testament, we read that the Holy Spirit was in the believer. In 1 Peter 1, verses 10 to 11, it says, concerning the salvation of our souls, the prophets sought and searched diligently. They prophesied of the grace that would come to you, searching for who or what kind of time the Spirit of Christ, which was in them, pointed when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the glories that would follow them. Notice that the Spirit of Christ was in them, in the Old Testament prophets. In John 14, verse 17 says, the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, for it doesn't see him and doesn't know him. You know him, for he lives with you and will be in you. So we see in the New Testament the promise by Jesus saying that the Holy Spirit is going to be in you. Now, was the Holy Spirit in Gentiles as well as Jews? Yes. You might say, give me an example. Numbers 24 verse 2 says, Balaam lifted up his eyes, and he saw Israel dwelling according to their tribes, and the Spirit of God came up on him. The word on in the Hebrew and in the Greek could also be translated in. So if you say, well, it's not on, it's not in, it's on, well, it's in the Old and New Testament, that word could be translated in. Now, examples of the Holy Spirit being in believers, we see it in Samson, in Saul, and David. In Samson, in Judges 14:4-5, it says, then Samson went down to Timnah with his father and his mother, and came to the vineyards of Timnah. And behold, a young lion roared at him. And Yahweh's Spirit came mightily on him, and he tore this lion as he would have torn a young goat with his bare hands. But he didn't tell his father or his mother what he had done. Saul also had the Holy Spirit in him. When they came there to the hill, behold, a band of prophets met him, and the Spirit of God came mightily on him, and he prophesied among them. When all who knew him before saw that, behold, he prophesied with the prophets. Then the people said to one another, what is this that has come to the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets? The Holy Spirit was also upon David. We see this in 1 Samuel 16, verse 13. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the middle of his brothers. Then Yahweh's Spirit came mightily on David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. So we see the Holy Spirit upon believers in the Old and New Testament. Now, there's a difference in the New Testament. The Holy Spirit doesn't leave the believer. In John 14:16, Jesus said, I will pray the Father, and he will give you another counselor, that he may be with you forever. Notice that, forever. We do have an example of this in Elisha. Elisha, when he died, the Holy Spirit still stood in him. He was so anointed, because he had double portion of Elijah's spirit, of the Holy Spirit, that they threw a dead body, and that dead body touched the bones, and that person came alive in 2 Kings. Okay, we have two examples of Samuel and Saul of the Holy Spirit leaving them. Judges 16:20. Delilah said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he, Samson, woke up of his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times and shake myself free. But he didn't know that Yahweh had departed from him. Samson did not know God departed from him. We also see in Saul, 1 Samuel 16:14, now Yahweh's Spirit departed from Saul, and an evil spirit of Yahweh troubled him. David, though I could not find any example of David losing the Holy Spirit, but there is a verse where David cries bitterly for the Holy Spirit not to leave him. This is after he sinned with Bathsheba. In Psalms 51 verse 11, David says, "Do not throw me from your presence, and don't take your Holy Spirit from me." David saw the Holy Spirit leave Saul, and David didn't want the same thing happening to him. In the New Testament, we read Christians grieving the Holy Spirit. Ephesians 4:30, we're told, "Don't grieve the Holy Spirit of God, in whom you were sealed for the day of redemption." So don't grieve the Holy Spirit, brothers and sisters. Don't grieve him. Try to live for him and try to obey what the Spirit tells you. The Spirit works with our conscience, and we need to listen to our conscience many times. We even read of the Holy Spirit being quenched by believers. This is to put a limit on what the person of the Holy Spirit wants to do in our lives. 1 Thessalonians 5:19 says, "Don't quench the Spirit." We as Christians cannot be in times without feeling his presence when we grieve him or when he decides to test us. But be sure he is still with the Christian. The Holy Spirit at times tests the Christian. He doesn't tempt us, but he will put us in a test. Who led Jesus in the desert for 40 days to be tempted by the devil? It was the Holy Spirit. After the baptism in Matthew 3 and Luke 3, we read, the Holy Spirit led Jesus to the desert to be tested by Satan. We could even defile his temple, which if a person does that, if you defile your body, you're defiling God's temple. For the Holy Spirit dwells in the Christian. And if you do that, God will destroy you for it. We read about the sin of death. What is that? Could John be in reference in 1 John? There is sin to death and there is sin that is not of death. Is that reference to a sin that the Holy Spirit will kill you? We have examples of this. 1 Corinthians 11 verses 29 and 30. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy way eats and drinks judgment to himself, if he doesn't discern the Lord's body. For this cause many among you are weak and sickly, and not a few sleep. Talking about death. The Corinthians, there were believers in the Corinthians church who died because they took the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner. In Acts 5, we see Ananias and Sapphira. Both of them struck dead by the Holy Spirit. There is sin that leads to death. 1 Corinthians 3:16 says, "Don't you know that you are the temple of God and the Spirit of God lives in you?" And it continues and says, "If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, which you are." Now, why is so important to talk about this? Because the Holy Spirit is the down payment or wedding ring of something bigger, for we are told, along with the Holy Spirit, the Father and Son are to dwell in us as well. 2 Corinthians 1:22 says, "Who also sealed us and gave us the down payment of the Spirit in our hearts." John 14:23 says, Jesus answered him, "If a man loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him." Some translation says, in him. Now Christ dwells in us only through the Holy Spirit. We read in Colossians 1:27, "To whom God was pleased to make known what are the riches of his glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. Christ in us is the hope of glory. Now, what is hope? We read in Romans 8:24 and 25, for we were saved in hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what? For that which he sees. But if we hope for that which we don't see, we wait for it patiently. Hope is waiting for something that you have not received yet. So we're waiting for Jesus to dwell in us along with the Father as well. Now, if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he's not of his. Who's the Spirit of Christ? The Holy Spirit. We're going to end our resurrection when Jesus comes in the second coming. We're going to have all three of them, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, dwelling in the believer. And this is going to be something amazing. God bless you, and I'll see you next program of Gangsters of Jesus. Bye.